At 2:14 a.m. on July 24, 2004, a light drizzle draped the quiet seaside town of Worthing in West Sussex, England. Street lamps glowed against the damp pavement, reflecting small pools of water shimmering like scattered beads. In a modest residential area not far from the coastline, a faint glow flickered inside a two-story house, where subdued voices and the creak of the floorboards hinted that someone was awake at this ungodly hour. A call soon went out to emergency services, the operator's calm but urgent instructions guiding the responders through the wet and deserted streets. When the first ambulance arrived, illuminated by the rotating red and white of its lights, the paramedics stepped out onto a driveway glistening with raindrops. Across the threshold, a man waited, with trembling hands, eyes brimming with disbelief and sorrow. In those first critical moments, nobody could fully grasp the complexity of the tragedy that had just unfolded inside those walls. The paramedics, trained to brace themselves for all sorts of trauma, were momentarily stunned by the intensity of the raw grief surrounding them. They found a 10-year-old boy lying motionless, his face peaceful, as though his voice wavered as he tried to explain what had happened, but the rushed conversation between him and the responders was fragmented and tense. Police officers arrived shortly afterward, exchanging loaded glances and clipped words that revealed a shared understanding that this was not a simple medical emergency. There was a gravity in the air that hinted at something far more serious. A few neighbors, roused by the flashing lights, peered from behind curtains or ventured onto their porches, uncertain whether to approach. The chill and the drizzle seemed to set the tone for the tragedy, now casting a pall. In the space of just a few minutes, an entire family's reality had been shattered, and the trajectory of a father's life had changed forever. A once ordinary home in Worthing became the scene of an extraordinary event, one that would soon capture the attention of the country and provoke a deeply polarized debate about parental love, morality, and responsibility. Andrew Wragg's 10-year-old son Jacob lay lifeless in an upstairs room. Soon, investigators, journalists, and onlookers across England would try to piece together how this child, who had battled this severe degenerative condition, ended his life in his own home. The father's tearful explanation about an act of mercy sent waves through the tight-knit community and beyond. What followed was a criminal investigation that raised not just legal questions, but profound moral and ethical. In the days, months, and years after that fateful early morning, the Wragg case would become a stark reminder of how quickly a family's private struggles can explode onto the public stage, and how a single act, driven by desperation or compassion, can demand the full weight of the law. Though the charge against Andrew Wragg was initially murder, the proceedings would soon unravel a layered story that shone light on a father's anguish, a child's suffering, and a legal system unsure how to respond. To grasp the full human scope of this tragedy, one must begin by looking at the life of the young boy lost to time that night and the father who made a catastrophic choice. Jacob Wragg, the victim at the heart of this case, came into the world on a crisp autumn day in 1993. He was born in the same West Sussex region he would call home for his entire life. To his family, the earliest moments of Jacob's infancy promised hope and possibility. He was the second child in the Wragg household, arriving after his parents, Andrew and Mary, had navigated the ups and downs of early adulthood together. By all accounts, the first few months of Jacob's life seemed, typical. He cried for feedings, clutched at his mother's finger, and cooed at passing shapes and lights the way any infant might. Friends and relatives described that he had a gentle temperament, rarely fussing unless he was hungry or uncomfortable. Yet even from his earliest days, subtle signs suggested that Jacob was not a perfectly healthy child. Small tasks like gripping objects or focusing his eyes became a struggle, and his doctors felt that his developmental milestones were lagging behind the standard growth chart. Mary, a devoted mother, made frequent visits to pediatric specialists, but it took several years of tests to confirm the underlying issue. This rare genetic disorder occurs when the body lacks an enzyme crucial for breaking down certain complex molecules, leading to a buildup that damages the child's organs, brain, and tissues over time. Initially, the family wrestled with confusion and denial. Andrew tried to reassure his wife, telling her that they would find the best treatments, the newest research, anything that might give Jacob a fighting chance. However, as the months wore on, the diagnosis became more certain, and the doctor's long-term prognosis was harrowing. Jacob was unlikely to develop along the normal path. He might lose physical abilities, and cognitive degeneration could follow. The severity varied from case to case, the doctors explained, but there was no established cure. Those with severe Hunter syndrome, particularly at that time, faced a shortened life expectancy that rarely extended beyond the teenage years. Despite the mounting wave of medical challenges, Jacob's life was not without its moments of joy and connection. He was described by many as a sweet-natured child who loved music and bright colors. His family adjusted their routines to accommodate wheelchairs, feeding schedules, and visits to special education facilities. Therapy sessions, both physical and cognitive, became a regular part of Jacob's day. In the midst of these constraints, there were glimpses of shared happiness: a short walk by the shore to feel the salt breeze, a modified trip to the local zoo where Jacob smiled at the colorful parrots. Photographs from family gatherings show Jacob with a half-smile, his gaze distant, yet occasionally playful. Over time, the challenges intensified. Jacob's limbs grew stiff, and basic tasks like feeding himself or speaking became increasingly difficult. His mother and father, once united in love and commitment, found their relationship strained as Jacob's care demands escalated. Andrew worked as a security consultant. Some accounts say he had served in the armed forces and used those skills in civilian life, while Mary took on the lion's share of day-to-day care. Extended family occasionally helped, but the emotional toll was significant. Communication became a monumental task for Jacob. A few fleeting words or gestures might emerge, but as the months turned into years, it became clear that this bright-eyed boy was fading behind the complexities of his condition. When Jacob reloaded the gun and called out to his parents on the other side of the ridge, they decided to let Jacob have the first shot, as the parents complained that they wanted to use their retirement money to pay for his expenses. Jacob's final timeline reveals a life marked by relentless doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, and moments of fleeting respite. In the year leading up to 2004, his condition seemed to worsen rapidly. Despite medical interventions, he lost more of his motor functions, needed around-the-clock supervision, and at times struggled to breathe. He reached his 10th birthday in the spring of that year, a bittersweet milestone. Family members recall how they held a small party, uncertain whether Jacob understood the significance but determined to celebrate his life. As the weeks passed, though, he seemed to slip further into discomfort. No longer able to articulate much beyond soft murmurs, he seemed perpetually exhausted and withdrawn. It is difficult to ascertain Jacob's true state of mind during those last months, given the profound limitations imposed by his illness. Some of his caretakers believed that he still found pleasure in music therapy and soft touches, while others observed a child who had become nearly unreachable. Medical reports indicated persistent pain and mounting complications. One nurse later testified that, in her opinion, Jacob's daily life had deteriorated to a point of near constant suffering. Yet it is crucial to acknowledge that only Jacob himself could truly know what he felt in those final moments. What is certain is that everyone in his orbit recognized the fragility of his body and mind, and braced themselves for the worst outcomes. While friends and family stood in sympathy and uncertainty around Jacob, Andrew Wragg was quietly struggling with a different kind of burden. Outwardly, he maintained the composure expected of a father, but internally he wrestled with guilt, despair, and the crushing realization that his son's life would be short and painful. On that early morning in July 2004, the father's inner turmoil became horrifyingly real when Jacob's life came to an end. Though the authorities would initially label it a homicide, the nuances of Andrew's actions and motivations would soon take center stage, casting him not only as a criminal defendant, but as a man whose entire world had caved in. Andrew Wragg's background stands in stark contrast to the delicate existence Jacob was forced to endure. Raised in England in a lower-middle-class household, Andrew learned from an early age to prize independence, discipline, and resilience. As a teenager, he was known to be physically active, dabbling in schools and occasional part-time work. After finishing school, he gravitated toward service, enlisting in the British Army, a move that would shape his worldview in unforeseeable ways. He served in a capacity that exposed him to the harsh realities of conflict zones, though details are scattered in public records. Some neighbors later claimed Andrew had been stationed in various locations, including the Middle East, absorbing experiences that left him both proud of his service and haunted by what he had seen. End of story. Trustful of life in the Middle East, he later held general school classes in the U.S., trustful of that too that he had survived it. When he returned to civilian life, Andrew carried a soldier's steely exterior, but harbored an undercurrent of personal conflict. He tried transitioning into a standard job market, eventually finding that his unique skill set fit best in private security and consultancy. Some accounts mention that he worked in security roles for corporations or during special events where crowd management was needed. He met Mary, his future wife, through a mutual friend, and their whirlwind courtship blossomed into marriage within a couple of years. The early period of their relationship is often described by friends as joyous and full of promise. They vacationed together, enjoyed nights out, and seemed on track to start a conventional family life. However, once Jacob's condition became apparent, Andrew's perspective on fatherhood and family responsibilities began to fracture. According to psychological evaluations later presented during trial, Andrew felt a creeping sense of helplessness as he watched his son's health decline. Whereas he had always been able to rely on discipline and direct action to solve problems, he found himself powerless against a genetic disease he could not control. But upon his death, a large number of parents resigned their children away and went down to the local churches where they could control their own fate. This tension simmered beneath his otherwise composed surface, growing more pronounced with each passing year. People who interacted with Andrew recalled moments of vulnerability that broke through his stoic facade. There were occasional outbursts of frustration, a slammed door, a raised voice, a lost temper over mundane household matters. Many attributed these reactions to the enormous stress he carried. In therapy sessions and in conversations with close friends, he hinted at feeling guilt that he could not save his son. He also felt pulled away from Mary, who, from his perspective, was forever focused on Jacob's care. Andrew tried to be supportive, but as time went on, he sought refuge in extra work assignments or extended hours in an attempt to distract himself. Some noticed he developed what seemed like an emotional distance from everyday family routines. He became more of a distant figure rather than an engaged father. Clinicians who evaluated Andrew noted signs of chronic stress and possible depression. The question of whether Andrew harbored a deeper psychological pathology was raised after the incident. Was he dealing with undiagnosed PTSD from his military years? Or had the immense strain of raising a severely disabled child fractured something within him that had once been stable? The legal proceedings later revealed glimpses of this inner turmoil. There were references to Andrew's nightmares about his son's eventual fate, his fear of seeing Jacob suffer in a hospital bed, and his inability to reconcile that image with any notion of a normal family life. In social contexts, Andrew projected competence and self-reliance. He volunteered for community events that required organizational skills, occasionally participated in local sports clubs, and tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Some acquaintances described him as friendly, though reserved, the type of man who rarely initiated conversation but was polite when spoken to. A few neighbors, upon learning about Jacob's condition, expressed sympathy and offered help, but Andrew seldom took them up on it. His pride and sense of privacy made him reluctant to share the emotional burdens that overshadowed his home. As Jacob's health deteriorated, Andrew found it increasingly challenging to hold on to his public persona of unwavering strength. Beneath that carefully maintained exterior, a darker sense of desperation took root. The father's interactions with Jacob in the final months were complex. On one hand, he tried to detach emotionally from the daily struggles of relentless medical care. On the other, those close to the family believed Andrew still loved his son deeply, though he expressed this love more through occasional gestures, like buying Jacob a new stuffed animal, rather than through hands-on caretaking. When Mary and Andrew separated for a time, it was partly due to the pressure that medical responsibilities exerted on their marriage. Even then, Andrew wrestled with the question of what the future held for both his son and himself. On the night of July 24, 2004, the culmination of Andrew's emotional unraveling resulted in a decision that would bring devastating consequences. Years of internal conflict, overshadowed by the demands of caring for a terminally ill child, had eroded the father's capacity to distinguish what might have been mercy from an irreversible act of violence. In examining his actions, one can track a pattern of growing disillusionment and despair. A father who saw no escape from his son's suffering or from the torment that accompanied it. Whether influenced by altruistic compassion or driven by his own inability to cope, Andrew performed an act that took Jacob's life and turned his own upside down. The evolution from a dutiful soldier to a grief-stricken father, and finally, to a man who committed manslaughter, underscores the heartbreaking spiral of events that can unfold when hope and reason disappear. While some condemned him outright, others viewed his actions through a lens of empathy, asking if society itself had failed to provide adequate support. In the end, the courts were left to decide whether Andrew Wragg was a cold-blooded criminal or a tragic figure whose final choice stemmed from unimaginable psychological and emotional pressures. In the weeks leading up to Jacob's death, the Wragg household existed in a tense and fragile equilibrium. Andrew's professional demands had only grown, while Mary spent most of her waking hours tending to Jacob's escalating medical needs. Communication between the couple became increasingly strained. They would exchange perfunctory updates about Jacob's treatments, but rarely did they take the time to address the emotional toll it was exacting on both of them. Andrew began sleeping in a separate room, partially due to his odd work hours, but also, some speculated, because of his growing sense of detachment from family life. Conversations around the dinner table occasionally touched on the future. What would happen if Jacob's condition deteriorated further? How long could Mary realistically be expected to cope? And what specialized facilities might be available? Doctors had floated the possibility that Jacob might benefit from extended hospital stays, or specialized hospice care if his suffering became too pronounced. Yet these discussions often ended in stalemate, with Mary refusing to imagine Jacob in long-term clinical settings and Andrew growing more resigned to the inevitability of heartbreak. As the family dynamic faltered, Andrew's mental state took darker turns. According to a friend who later testified, Andrew once confided that he feared Jacob's life had become nothing but pain. He then quickly changed the subject, as though even articulating the thought was too much for him to bear. Mary, overwhelmed by fatigue and stress, reported feeling that Andrew was no longer truly present. He would nod and mutter responses, but the empathy that once colored his voice was noticeably absent. During this pre-crime period, there were also small signs of Andrew's ongoing attempt to maintain normalcy. He kept up his gym routine, went out for occasional beers with work colleagues, and tried to bury himself in his assignments. While some interpret these actions as a father doing his best to cope, others later argued that it showed Andrew willfully distancing himself, as if he was rehearsing a future in which Jacob might no longer be there. These conflicting interpretations would loom large after the tragedy, as investigators and legal experts tried to discern whether Andrew's state of mind was more akin to a premeditated approach or a desperate cry. One evening, about 2 weeks before the incident, a heated argument erupted between Andrew and Mary. She accused him of abandoning them emotionally and questioned whether he had the resolve to stand by their son. Andrew, for his part, insisted he had reached the limits of what he could endure. Witnesses within earshot recalled Mary's tearful pleas. She felt alone and terrified, and Andrew's subdued but seething response that they were only prolonging the inevitable. Behavior so unheard of, it was apparently the norm after all. This argument was not a clear sign that Andrew might take Jacob's life, but it did crystallize the emotional fault lines cracking beneath the surface of the family. The trigger for Andrew's final act remains a subject of speculation. Perhaps it was something small, a worsening of Jacob's symptoms that night, the child's difficulty breathing, or the sight of yet another medical apparatus attached to Jacob's frail body. Perhaps it was a cumulative effect of exhaustion and heartbreak. In the aftermath, Andrew would claim that he could no longer witness Jacob's suffering. Though many questioned the authenticity of this sentiment, it's possible that, in that moment, Andrew believed he was sparing his son more agony. It is also possible that Andrew was primarily trying to spare himself from what he saw as an agonizing inevitability. The events of July 24, 2004 were sudden, yet strangely quiet. Andrew was alone in the house with Jacob at the time. Mary had stepped away, possibly to run errands or simply to catch a breath from the relentless cycle of care. Sometime before dawn, Andrew made his way to Jacob's room. The boy was asleep, breathing shallowly as the various medical devices beeped or hummed softly. Andrew later claimed that Jacob seemed to be in distress, though the precise details remain murky. What is known is that Andrew suffocated Jacob. Early police reports describe the manner as smothering, though the exact method, whether with a pillow or by pressing his own hands over the boy's mouth, became a technical point of dispute. There was no prolonged struggle. Jacob was physically weak and likely disoriented, making it impossible for him to resist. The final moments of his life, as recounted by forensic experts, were characterized by minimal outward trauma, suggesting that the end came swiftly. In the immediate aftermath, Andrew placed a call to emergency services, speaking in a subdued monotone and claiming that his son had died. On the recorded call, he did not initially admit to suffocating Jacob. Instead, he implied that Jacob's breathing had stopped and that he could not revive him. When paramedics arrived to find Jacob's body still warm, they attempted CPR to no avail. Andrew hovered nearby, almost in a trance, eventually uttering the words that he couldn't bear it any longer. According to one responding officer, Andrew seemed oddly calm, as though his most harrowing step had been taken, and now he was left with a hollow acceptance of what he had done. From that moment the scene grew chaotic. Mary arrived home to the sight of police cars and an ambulance. Neighbors had gathered on the street, whispering and trying to understand what had transpired. Mary's screams tore through the damp morning air, and she collapsed into a wailing heap upon being told that Jacob was gone. The look of desperation on her face would later haunt the first responders who witnessed it. Andrew, meanwhile, was placed under arrest. He offered no resistance and no further explanation beyond a few mumbled phrases about helping his son. Police guided him into a squad car, while investigators began the painstaking process of cataloging the scene, photographing Jacob's small bedroom, and collecting the limited physical evidence: a pillow, blankets, various medical devices. Over the next several hours, Andrew was taken to a police station for questioning. He was read his rights and provided with legal counsel, though he appeared too numb to fully engage. In his first official statement, he admitted to ending Jacob's life. He stated that he acted out of compassion, describing how he had watched his son deteriorate year after year. The statement was methodical, but emotionally fraught. Andrew's voice reportedly cracked in parts, and tears threatened to interrupt his sentences. Investigators listened, took notes, and prepared to charge him with murder under English law. Rumors of the father's confession rippled through the local community, then spread nationwide as tabloids seized on the story of a disabled child allegedly killed by a parent who claimed a twisted mercy. Speculation soared. Some insisted Andrew was a monster. Others, citing the documented struggles of the Wragg family, entertained the possibility that Andrew had acted out of genuine, if misguided, love. Forensic examinations at the house found no signs of a broader struggle, no scrawled notes indicating a plan. The bed was tidy except for where paramedics had moved Jacob, and there was no direct evidence of a violent confrontation. Police did, however, collect Andrew's pillowcase for further testing, hoping it might reveal fibers or biological remnants consistent with suffocation. In the days that followed, the story broke in the national media. Journalists camped outside the police station, hungry for details. Headlines ran the gamut from condemning Andrew as a cold-blooded killer to sympathizing with a father at the end of his emotional tether. Meanwhile, investigators worked steadily, compiling interviews and building a case file. They discovered that Andrew's social media presence was minimal, leading them little to comb through. Instead, they relied heavily on statements from Mary, neighbors, and Andrew himself. Mary, devastated, explained that she had never considered her husband capable of harming Jacob, let alone ending his life. A subsequent autopsy confirmed that Jacob had died from asphyxiation. The medical examiner noted the telltale signs of restricted airflow in the lungs and mouth area. No lethal levels of medication were found in Jacob's system, ruling out any notion that Andrew might have administered a drug overdose. This clarified that the cause of death was indeed mechanical suffocation, though the exact mechanism, pillow or hand, remained somewhat ambiguous. Yet from a legal standpoint it hardly mattered. Either scenario amounted to the deliberate taking of a life. Once Andrew confessed, the focus shifted from proving culpability to understanding motive, mental state, and whether or not there was a legal basis for a lesser charge. The police and Crown Prosecution Service recognized that Andrew's admission was straightforward, but the complexities surrounding Jacob's illness and Andrew's emotional condition demanded a thorough forensic and psychological evaluation. Some investigators suspected that Andrew might have planned the act, pointing to the weeks of tension and his seemingly methodical approach. Others posited that it was a spontaneous act driven by an emotional collapse. Within 48 hours of the discovery of Jacob's body, Andrew had been formally charged with murder. Detectives spent that crucial window of time interviewing everyone close to the family, seizing Andrew's personal items, and scrutinizing phone records. They wanted to ensure no stone went unturned. If Andrew had confided in anyone about his intentions, that could point to premeditation, strengthening the murder charge. In some cases, rejecting the wrong charge. Alternatively, if the defense could show he was suffering from a mental breakdown that impaired his judgment, it might pave the way for a manslaughter verdict or diminished responsibility plea. Despite the gravity of the case, the early investigation lacked the typical hallmarks of a violent crime scene. There were no frantic altercations or hidden weapons, no forensic labyrinth to untangle. Jacob's bedroom was clinically neat, lined with medical devices, a testament to how carefully his condition had been managed up until that final moment. In some ways, the lack of dramatic physical evidence left detectives focused on intangible elements: Andrew's psychological state, the family's circumstances, and the heartbreaking details of Jacob's illness. As the investigation continued, forensic experts performed a deeper analysis of the pillowcase, blankets, and any surfaces that might have come into contact with the boy's mouth or airways. Tiny fibers found in Jacob's nose and on his lips matched those from the pillow, consistent with smothering. The data corroborated Andrew's confession. Meanwhile, the local pathology lab processed hair and tissue samples, confirming once again that suffocation had been the cause of death. The lead forensic pathologist gave a grim but simple statement. The child died from oxygen deprivation, inflicted externally, consistent with homicide. In parallel, the evidence processing team meticulously reviewed Andrew's phone records, searching for last-minute calls or text messages that could suggest he had reached out to anyone before ending Jacob's life. They found no frantic pleas or announcements, only routine messages about bills, and a few missed calls from Mary. If Andrew had been seeking advice or a final sign, it didn't appear to have come via phone. Investigators also combed through the family's computer, looking for internet searches on euthanasia or related topics. Although certain searches about Hunter syndrome, end-of-life care, and ethical discussions around severely ill children were discovered, they dated back months and did not conclusively prove any recent premeditated plan. Throughout this time, Andrew's demeanor in custody veered between stoic acceptance and bouts of quiet weeping. He repeated the assertion that he had killed Jacob, but insisted he had done it so his son wouldn't suffer anymore. Several newspapers picked up on this statement, splashing sensational headlines that asked, "Mercy killing or murder?" the public discourse that erupted ranged from condemnation to heartfelt sympathy for a father who allegedly tried to spare his child a painful future. Police interviews with Mary provided important breakthrough elements. She described in detail the exhausting routines of caring for Jacob, the strain on her marriage, and Andrew's increasing detachment. While she condemned Andrew's act, calling it unthinkable, she also described how they had occasionally talked about how cruel the disease was. Mary insisted she had never even entertained the idea of taking Jacob's life, but she acknowledged that Andrew might have felt differently. Investigators interpreted these comments as evidence that Andrew had not acted entirely on a sudden whim. At the same time, Mary's accounts of Andrew's emotional volatility lent weight to the notion that Andrew's mental state was precarious. As detectives pieced together the day-to-day existence inside the Wragg household, they began to see the relentless stress that had built up over years. Counselors, social workers, and local respite care agencies had been involved intermittently, but it was clear the entire burden of Jacob's specialized care largely rested on the family. One social worker lamented that the system at the time was woefully inadequate in supporting families with complex, life-limiting pediatric conditions. This would become a point of contention in the broader social debate about the Wragg case, whether insufficient support structures contributed to Andrew's breaking point. The final investigative report concluded that Andrew had caused Jacob's death through asphyxiation. It recommended that the Crown Prosecution Service pursue a murder charge, given that Andrew had knowingly ended his son's life. However, prosecutors were also aware of the mitigating factors: Andrew's mental state, Jacob's degenerative condition, and the father's immediate admission of guilt. Ultimately, the case moved forward to the courts, where the legal system would grapple with the question of whether Andrew's actions constituted premeditated murder, manslaughter, or some rare exemption under the concept of diminished responsibility. In the midst of mounting public scrutiny, Andrew's legal team and the prosecutors began the pre-trial process. Andrew was formally arrested on suspicion of murder and, after a series of preliminary hearings, was charged with that crime. The question that loomed was whether the charge would remain murder or be reduced to manslaughter, either by a plea deal or by the court's acknowledgement of diminished responsibility. The pre-trial procedures involved psychological evaluations, the collection of medical records concerning Jacob's condition, and depositions from any witness with insight into Andrew's state of mind. The magnitude of media attention created an added layer of complexity. Every legal maneuver was scrutinized by journalists and the public alike. During one preliminary hearing, Andrew's defense team filed motions indicating they would argue that Andrew was under extreme emotional distress, suffering from a depressive disorder exacerbated by the demands of caring for a terminally ill child. They also cited his prior military service and possible undiagnosed PTSD as factors that contributed to his mental instability. The prosecution, however, contended that Andrew made a conscious decision to kill Jacob, stating that even if it was an impulsive act, it did not absolve him of criminal responsibility for the deliberate taking of a life. With these lines drawn, the stage was set for a trial that promised to test the boundaries of empathy versus legal accountability. When the trial finally commenced, the courtroom was filled to capacity, with reporters and curious members of the public crowding the gallery. Jacob's name evoked a hush. In an effort to maintain dignity, the presiding judge reminded everyone that a young boy's life had been lost, and that the proceedings should reflect seriousness and respect. The prosecution opened with a stark narrative, a father who, by his own admission, suffocated his disabled child. The lead prosecutor presented evidence from the autopsy, the forensic findings on the pillowcase, and Andrew's recorded confession to emergency personnel. This was not a whodunit, they argued, but a matter of holding Andrew accountable for a conscious act of homicide. Testimony from paramedics and police officers painted a picture of the immediate aftermath: Andrew's calm acceptance, Jacob's still warm body, and Mary's anguished screams. The prosecution highlighted how Andrew had not contacted Mary or sought emergency medical intervention until after Jacob's death. They posited that a reasonable parent, witnessing a child in distress, would first try to save the child rather than end his life. Through cross-examination, The prosecution challenged any suggestion that Andrew had acted purely on compassion, insinuating that Andrew's primary motive may have been to free himself from the burden of Jacob's extensive care. Their stance was that, no matter how severe the child's condition, it was not Andrew's right to unilaterally decide to end Jacob's life. In response, the defense mounted a layered strategy that combined psychological testimony with a detailed account of Jacob's deteriorating condition. Clinical experts described Andrew's mental health in the months leading up to the incident, outlining a trajectory of depression, anxiety, and possible PTSD rooted in his military background. One psychologist testified that Andrew's sense of hope had eroded over years of witnessing his son's pain, driving him to a state of acute despair. The defense sought to portray Andrew not as a heartless killer, but as a father who genuinely believed he was sparing his son endless suffering. They underscored that Andrew surrendered to police willingly, made a full confession, and showed deep remorse. Moreover, multiple medical professionals provided testimony about Hunter syndrome, explaining its terminal nature, the significant pain associated with advanced stages, and the bleak prognosis for someone in Jacob's condition. The defense used these facts to bolster their argument that Andrew's mindset was colored by witnessing a protracted decline, day in and day out, leaving him convinced that Jacob had no semblance of a quality of life left. After days of emotional testimony, Mary took the stand. Her voice trembled as she recounted her last moments with Jacob. She spoke of her love for her child, her frantic attempt to maintain normalcy, and her shock upon learning that Andrew had taken matters into his own hands. Though she expressed anger and devastation at Andrew, she also conveyed a measure of sympathy for the psychological pressures he had faced. Under cross-examination, Mary clarified that she had never authorized or condoned such an act, but she acknowledged she had seen her husband unravel over time. Her testimony had a profound effect on the courtroom, capturing the agony of a family torn apart by tragedy. It made her the greatest author in the history of American politics. In their closing arguments, the prosecution reiterated that pity or desperation did not absolve Andrew from the legal definition of murder. They insisted that no matter how difficult the circumstances, the law protected the sanctity of life. The defense, meanwhile, pleaded for the jury to see the tragedy in context. They argued that Andrew was not an evil man, but a broken father who believed, however wrongly, that he was delivering his son from torment. They urged the jury to consider a verdict of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, a legal provision under English law that recognizes a defendant's mental incapacity to fully comprehend or control his actions. The jury deliberated with heavy hearts for days. When they finally returned with their decision, they found Andrew guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The judge, citing the compelling psychological factors, sentenced Andrew to a term of imprisonment that was largely suspended, reflecting the court's view that this was a case of extreme emotional duress rather than premeditated malice. The reaction from the public was divided. Some lauded the decision as compassionate, given the harrowing circumstances. Others saw it as a worrying precedent, fearing it might encourage others to take similar actions when caring for severely ill relatives. Immediately following the trial, the community wrestled with a torrent of emotions. In Worthing, where neighbors had known Andrew as a polite if reserved figure, there was shock and a sense of collective sorrow. Many turned up for Jacob's funeral, placing flowers and handwritten notes by the graveside. Local media outlets covered the service respectfully, focusing on the memory of a child who had fought valiantly against a merciless disease. Yet the undercurrents of anger and confusion were palpable. Some residents condemned Andrew, claiming that no parent had the right to decide when a child's life should end. Others countered that the family's situation was more complex than outsiders could fathom. In the broader public arena, editorial columns and talk shows lit up with debates about the adequacy of social services for families with terminally ill children. Disability rights activists pointed out that labeling a disabled life as less worth living was a dangerous path, possibly normalizing euthanasia without robust legal and ethical frameworks. In the immediate aftermath, both families, Andrew's and Mary's extended kin, faced the grueling challenge of reconciling the irreparable loss of Jacob and the irrevocable act that Andrew had committed. Mary in particular bore the weight of grief for her child, coupled with the logistical and emotional burdens of moving forward with her life. The heartbreak extended to grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins who had cherished Jacob. For them, the finality of his passing and the manner in which it happened were almost too painful to comprehend. Over time, the ripple effects of the Wragg case contributed to discussions within the National Health Service (NHS) and local councils about strengthening palliative care and respite services. Some called for increased mental health support specifically targeted to parents of children with severe disabilities. While no sweeping legislative changes immediately arose, certain hospitals and care facilities piloted new family support initiatives. Charities involved in rare disease advocacy used the case to highlight the daily struggles families face, lobbying for more comprehensive in-home care and financial assistance. Looking back years later, legal scholars cited the Andrew Wragg verdict in discussions about how courts handle cases that sit at the nexus of mercy killing and homicide. The case became a reference point for analyzing how diminished responsibility is applied when a parent kills a severely disabled child. It also stoked deeper cultural conversations about the moral obligations of caregiving. The tension between compassion and the absolute value of life remains an unsettled question, but the Wragg case added another layer of nuance to an already complex topic. In historical retrospectives, the Andrew Wragg case is often cited alongside other instances where a parent has ended a child's life under claims of mercy. Journalists looking back on 2004 note that media coverage at the time was sensationalistic, with headlines that either demonized Andrew or lauded him as a tormented hero. The reality, as is so often the case, was far more layered. The child at the center was not merely a statistic, but a young boy who once smiled at the sight of bright birds, and who endured pain beyond what most people can imagine. Reflecting on the case, some argue that it underscored a critical gap in mental health screening for parents wrestling with the daily torment of caring for a severely ill child. Had Andrew received more robust psychological support, or had there been earlier interventions, perhaps Jacob would have remained in palliative care until a natural death took him. Others maintain that no amount of intervention could have convinced Andrew that Jacob's suffering was worthwhile, or that life in such a debilitating state could still be lived with dignity. These questions linger, with no definitive answers. Let's continue our conversation with Alex, who heard later that day on the radio due to the encroaching distance. Summarizing the key points of this devastating case, one must start with the heartbreaking reality of Jacob's illness. Diagnosed with Hunter syndrome, he faced a brief and painful existence. Andrew Wragg, once a disciplined soldier and later a security consultant, became psychologically undone by the relentless weight of witnessing his son's decline. Tensions in the home escalated as Jacob's condition worsened, culminating in the early morning of July 24, 2004, when Andrew suffocated his child. Forensic evidence, particularly fiber analysis, showed a clear act of homicide. Andrew confessed, and his trial became a platform for a societal debate about mercy killings, caregiving, and the boundaries of the law. In the end, the verdict was manslaughter, influenced by expert testimony about Andrew's fragile mental state and Jacob's dire medical prognosis. The legal resolution reflected the complexity of the act, acknowledging criminal responsibility, but tempering punishment with an understanding of the extreme emotional duress. End of Chapter 4. The implications of the Wragg case echo through legal, social, and moral discussions. Legally, it highlighted how English courts might handle parental killings, steeped in claims of compassion. Socially, it exposed the limited resources available for families with terminally ill children, raising questions about whether society shares in the responsibility when caregivers reach a breaking point. From a policy perspective, the case fueled incremental improvements in palliative care and respite support, although comprehensive reforms remain elusive. The long-term consequences are perhaps most poignantly felt in the memory of Jacob, and in the complicated emotional lives of those who knew him. Their grief and reflections continue to inform conversations about how we, as a society, balance compassion for suffering with the sanctity of human life. The Wragg case also underscored that tragedies born of desperation can happen even in seemingly ordinary neighborhoods. The quiet street in Worthing where neighbors once waved to each other and offered polite small talk became a site of somber reflection. Some locals reported feeling a renewed sense of vigilance, checking in on friends or acquaintances caring for ill-loved ones. Others retreated from the subject, finding it too harrowing to contemplate. But for those directly affected, the ripple effects would never fully subside. As the years passed, Andrew struggled to rebuild some semblance of life outside prison, haunted by the knowledge that he had ended his own child's life. Mary attempted to move forward, finding support in counseling and local grief groups. Extended family members quietly tried to stitch together the leftover fragments of normalcy. There was no simple closure, only an understanding that the best anyone could do was strive to remember Jacob's gentle spirit and learn from the enormity of what had happened. In contemplating this entire trajectory, we return to the very human element at its core: a father, a mother, and a severely disabled child caught in a web of pain and love. The Wragg family story serves as both a cautionary tale and a call for greater empathy, reminding us that the line between compassion and harm can become perilously blurred under the weight of relentless despair. Some might walk away from this story feeling outraged at Andrew's actions. Others might feel heartbreak, or even a sliver of understanding. Yet all can agree that Jacob's short life demanded more tenderness, more support, and more humane solutions than what he ultimately received. None of this erases the gravity of Andrew's decision. To end a life, especially that of one's own child, is an irreversible act that can never be justified lightly. And yet, the case compels a broader reflection on how we, as individuals and communities, address profound suffering. In many ways, Andrew Wragg's sentence did not end when the court delivered its verdict. The weight of his actions will remain with him for as long as he lives. The memory of Jacob, too, lingers in the collective conscience, a reminder of a little boy who endured far more than a child ever should, and whose final moments became a flashpoint for one of society's most difficult moral questions. The complexities of this case illuminate how crucial it is for families caring for children with life-limiting illnesses to have comprehensive emotional, financial, and medical support. Perhaps if more robust resources had been available, if a mental health safety net had caught Andrew, if better palliative care options had offered a gentler path for Jacob, the outcome might have been different. End of Chapter 1. Instead, the system and the individuals within it reached their limits on that rainy morning in July. It is a tragedy that resonates with parents, caregivers, and policymakers alike. Though no single narrative can fully capture the heartbreak lived by Jacob or the labyrinth of thought and emotion that led Andrew Wragg to commit this devastating act, the enduring lesson is that tragedies do not occur in a vacuum. They are shaped by personal histories, social structures, and the limitations of the human heart. Even as society advances in medical science and social welfare, the Wragg case remains a sobering example of how quickly a loving bond can turn fatal when despair and helplessness overshadow reason. In the final analysis, the story of Andrew Wragg and his son Jacob offers a timeline of events that underscore the lethal potential of a single choice made under extreme emotional duress. Their tragedy forced a legal system, a community, and a nation to confront the stark edges of mercy and murder. It highlighted the fragility of life in the face of terminal illness and the moral perils of believing one can unilaterally end that suffering. While the courts rendered their verdict, the broader moral questions linger, inviting ongoing dialogue about how to best protect and support families caught in such heartbreaking storms. If there is a call to action here, it lies in urging communities and healthcare systems to deepen their support networks for families struggling with severe disabilities. Stories like Jacob's should compel us to offer respite care, psychological counseling, and community outreach long before a parent's frustration and despair become unmanageable. Each of us can play a role by volunteering, advocating, or simply checking in on neighbors who might be overwhelmed by caretaking responsibilities. Even small acts of compassion can alleviate the sense of isolation that fosters desperation. In the spirit of meaningful engagement, one might ask, have you or someone you know faced the crushing weight of caring for a loved one with a life-limiting condition? How did you navigate that path, and what support made a difference? If we share experiences, dissect the failings of support systems, and discuss possible reforms, we can encourage a more empathetic and proactive community response. Cases like Andrew Wragg's should not be mere headlines. They should be a catalyst for ensuring that no parent ever feels fulfilled, so alone, so trapped, that they commit an irreversible act. Tragedy often begets reflection, and reflection begets dialogue. Let us use this space to explore how communities can step up, how medical professionals can better identify red flags, and how policymakers can direct funding to palliative care and mental health services. By turning the focus to prevention and compassionate intervention, we might honor Jacob's memory in a way that transcends the heartbreaking details of his final moments. Together we can push for the resources, awareness, and empathy needed to ensure families are truly supported when confronted with the unimaginable burden of a child's terminal diagnosis. And, in so doing, strive to prevent another tragedy like the Wragg case from unfolding in the shadows.